Triangulation supports agricultural spread of the Trans-Eurasian languages. This article is wrote by Martin Rubitz and 40 more authors. The origin and early dispersal of speakers of Trans-Eurasian languages, that is Japanese, Korean, Tungusic, Mongolic, and Turkic, is among the most disputed issues of Eurasian population history. A key problem is the relationship between linguistic dispersals, agricultural expansions, and population movements. Here we address this question by triangulating genetics, archaeology, and linguistics in a unified perspective. We report wide-ranging datasets from these disciplines, including a comprehensive Trans-Eurasian agricultural and basic vocabulary, an archaeological database of 255 Neolithic Bronze Age sites from Northeast Asia, and a collection of Asian genomes from Korea, the Ryukyu Islands, and early cereal farmers in Japan, complementing previously published genomes from East Asia, challenging the traditional pastoralist hypothesis. We show that the common ancestry and primary dispersals of Trans-Eurasian languages can be traced back to the first farmers moving across Northeast Asia from the early Neolithic onwards, but that this shared heritage has been masked by extensive cultural interaction since the Bronze Age, as well as marking considerable progress in the three individual disciplines. By combining their converging evidence, we show that the early spread of Trans-Eurasian speakers was driven by agriculture. Recent breakthroughs in Asian DNA sequencing have made us rethink the connection between human, linguistic, and cultural expansions across Eurasia. Compared to Western Eurasia, however, Eastern Eurasia remains poorly understood. Northeast Asia, the vast region encompassing Inner Mongolia, the Yellow, Liao, and Amur river basins, the Russian Far East, the Korean Peninsula, and the Japanese islands, remains especially underrepresented in the recent literature. With a few exceptions that are heavily focused on genetics or limited to reviewing existing datasets, truly interdisciplinary approaches to Northeast Asia are scarce. The linguistic relatedness of the Trans-Eurasian languages, also known as Altaic, is among the most disputed issues in linguistic prehistory. Trans-Eurasian denotes a large group of geographically adjacent languages stretching across Europe and Northern Asia, and includes 5 uncontroversial linguistic families: Japonic, Koreanic, Tungusic, Mongolic, and Turkic. These 5 groups descend from a single common ancestor has been the topic of a long-standing debate between supporters of inheritance and borrowing. Recent assessments show that even if many common properties between these languages are indeed due to borrowing, there is nonetheless a core of reliable evidence for the classification of Trans-Eurasian as a valid genealogical group. Accepting these classifications, however, gives rise to new questions about the time depth, location, cultural identity, and dispersal routes of ancestral Trans-Eurasian speech communities. Here we challenge the traditional pastoralist hypothesis that identifies the primary dispersals of the Trans-Eurasian languages with nomadic expansions, starting in the eastern steppe in the 4th millennium before present, by proposing a farming hypothesis which places those dispersals within the scope of the farming language dispersal hypothesis. As these issues reach far beyond linguistics, We address them by integrating archaeology and genetics in a single approach termed triangulation. We collected a new dataset of 3,193 cognate sets that represent 254 basic vocabulary concepts for 98 Trans-Eurasian languages, including dialects and historical varieties. We applied Bayesian methods to infer a dated phylogeny of the Trans-Eurasian languages. Our results indicate a time depth of 9,181 BP for the Proto-Trans-Eurasian root of the family, 6,811 BP for Proto-Altaic, the unity of Turkic, Mongolic, and Tungusic languages, 4,491 BP for Mongolo-Tungusic, and 5,458 BP for Japano-Koreanic. These dates estimate the time depth of the initial breakup of a given language family into more than one foundational subgroup. This data figure shows that reconstructed locations of Trans-Eurasian ancestral languages spoken during the Neolithic, which is red, and the Bronze Age, and later, which is green. For detailed homeland detection, see Supplementary Data 4. The estimated time depth is based on Bayesian inference presented in Supplementary Data 24. We used our lexical dataset to model the expansion of Trans-Eurasian languages in space. We applied Bayesian phylogeography to complement classical approaches, such as lexicostatics, the diversity hotspot principle, and cultural reconstruction. In contrast to previously proposed homelands, which range from the Altai to the Yellow River, to the Greater Khingan Mountains, to the Amur Basin, we find support for a Trans-Eurasian origin in the West Liao River region in the early Neolithic. After a primary breakup of the family in the Neolithic, further dispersals took place in the late Neolithic and Bronze Age. The ancestor of the Mongolic languages expanded northwards to the Mongolian plateau. Proto-Turkic moved westwards over the eastern steppe, and the other branches moved eastwards. Proto-Tungusic to the Amur-Ussuri Khanga region, Proto-Koreanic to the Korean peninsula, and Proto-Japonic over Korea to the Japanese islands. Through a qualitative analysis in which we examined agro-pastoral words that were revealed in the reconstructed vocabulary of the proto-languages, we further identified items that are culturally diagnostic for ancestral speech communities in a particular region at a particular time. Common ancestral languages that are separated in the Neolithic, such as Proto-Trans-Eurasian, Proto-Altaic, Proto-Mongolo-Tungusic, and Proto-Japano-Koreanic, reflect a small core of inherited words that relate to cultivation, field, sow, plant, grow, cultivate, spade. Millets but not rice or other crops. Millet seeds, millet gruel, barnyard millet. Food production and preservation. Ferment, grind, crush to pulp, brew. Wild foods suggestive of sedentism. Walnut, acorn, chestnut. Textile production. Sew, weave cloth, weave with a loom, spin, cut cloth, raimi, hemp, and the pigs and the dogs as the only domesticated animals. By contrast, individual subfamilies that separated in the Bronze Age, such as Turkic, Mongolic, Tungusic, Koreanic, and Japonic, inserted new subsistence terms that relate to the cultivation of rice, wheat, and barley, dairying, domesticated animals such as cattle, sheep, and horses, farming or kitchen tools, and textiles such as silk. These words are borrowings that result from linguistic interaction between Bronze Age populations speaking various Trans-Eurasian and non-Trans-Eurasian languages. In summary, the age, homeland, original agricultural vocabulary, and context profile of the Trans-Eurasian family support the farming hypothesis and exclude the pastoralist hypothesis. Although Neolithic Northeast Asia was characterized by widespread plant cultivation, cereal farming expanded from several centers of domestication, the most important of which for Trans-Eurasian was the West Liao Basin, where cultivation of broom corn millet started by 9000 BP. Extracting data from the published literature, we scored 172 archaeological features for 255 Neolithic and Bronze Age sites, and compiled an inventory of 269 directly carbon, 14 dated early crop remains in northern China, the Primorye, Korea, and Japan. This is the geographical distribution of 255 sites from the Neolithic, which is red, and the Bronze Age, which is green. The main results of our Bayesian analysis, which clusters the 255 sites according to cultural similarity, are visualized in Figure 2b. We find a cluster of Neolithic cultures in the West Liao Basin, from which two branches associated with millet farming separate, a Korean Zulmun branch and a branch of Neolithic cultures covering the Amur, Primorye, and Liaodong. This confirms previous findings about the dispersal of millet agriculture to Korea by 5500 BP and via the Amur to the Primorye by 5000 BP. Our analysis further clusters Bronze Age sites in the West Liao area with Mumun sites in Korea and Yayoi sites in Japan. This mirrors how during the 4th millennium BP the agricultural package of the Liaodong, Shandong area was supplemented with rice and wheat. These crops were transmitted to the Korean peninsula by the early Bronze Age, and from there to Japan after 3000 BP. This is the geographical distribution of 255 sites from the Neolithic, which is red, and the Bronze Age, which is green. Colored dots clusters the investigated sites according to the cultural similarity in line with Bayesian analysis in Supplementary Data 25, with indication of the spread of millet and rice in time and space. The distribution of archaeological sites in Figure 2 is smaller than that of contemporary languages in Figure 1, because we focus on the early dispersal of the linguistic subgroups in the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, and on the links between the eastward spread of farming and language dispersal. Although population movements were not linked with monothetic archaeological cultures, Neolithic farming expansions in Northeast Asia was associated with some diagnostic features, such as stone tools for cultivation and harvesting and textile technology. Domesticated animals and dairying had an important role in the spread of the Neolithic in Western Eurasia, but except for dogs and pigs, our data shows little evidence for animal domestication in Northeast Asia before the Bronze Age. The link between agriculture and population migrations is especially clear for similarities between ceramics, stone tools, domestic, and burial agriculture between Korea and Western Japan. Building on previous studies, we provide an overview of demographic changes associated with the introduction of millet farming across the regions in our study. Having invested in elaborate paddy fields, wet rice farmers tended to stay in one place, absorbing population growth through extra labor, whereas millet farmers typically adopted a more expansionary settlement pattern. Neolithic population densities increased across Northeast Asia before a population crash in the late Neolithic. The Bronze Age then saw exponential population increases in China, Korea, and Japan. We report genomic analysis of 19 authenticated ancient individuals from the Amur, Korea, Kyushu, and the Ryukyus, and combine them with published genomes that cover the Eastern Steppe, West Liao, Amur, and Yellow River regions, Liaodong, Shandong, the Primorye, and Japan between 9500 and 300 BP. We projected them onto a principal component analysis of 149 present-day Eurasian populations and 45 East Asian populations. Figure 3b models our key ancient populations as an admixture of 5 genetic components, whereby Jalynor represents Amur, Yangshao the Yellow River, and Rokutsu the Jomon genome, whereas Hongshan and Upper Xiaoyedin in the West Liao River are composed of Yellow River and Amur genomes. This is the spatio-temporal distribution and admixture of Asian genomes. Asian genomes are located in time and space. Contemporary Tungusic as well as Nyingma speakers in the Amur form a tight cluster. Neolithic hunter-gatherers from Baikal, Primorye, and the southeastern steppe, as well as farmers from the West Liao and Amur, all project within this cluster. Late Neolithic Engengshi show a high proportion of Amur-like ancestry, whereas West Liao Neolithic millet farmers show a considerable proportion of Amur-like ancestry with a gradual shift towards the Yellow River genome over time. Although we lack early Neolithic genomes in the West Liao River, Amur-like ancestry thus is likely to represent the original genetic profile of indigenous pre-Neolithic or late Paleolithic hunter-gatherers covering Baikal, Amur, Primorye, the southeastern steppe, and West Liao, continuing in the early farmers from this region. This contradicts a recent genetic study which concludes that the absence of Yellow River influence in Asian genomes from Mongolia and the Amur does not support the West Liao genetic correlate of the Trans-Eurasian language family. The PCA shows a general trend for Neolithic individuals from Mongolia to contain high Amur-like ancestry with extensive gene flow from Western Eurasia increasing from the Bronze to Middle Ages. Whereas the Turkic-speaking Xiongnu, Old Uyghur, and Turk are extremely scattered, the Mongolic-speaking Iron Age Sanbei fall closer to the Amur cluster than the Shiwei, Ruan, Kirin, and Middle Mongolian Khanate from antiquity in the Middle Ages. As Amur-related ancestry can be traced down to speakers of Japanese and Korean, it appears to be the original genetic component common to all speakers of Trans-Eurasian languages. By analyzing ancient genomes from Korea, we find that Jomon ancestry was present on the peninsula by 6000 BP. The proximal QP-ADM modeling suggests that Neolithic Endo can be entirely derived from an ancestry related to Hongshan, whereas Yeondaedo and Changhang can be modeled as an admixture of Jomon with a high proportion of Hongshan ancestry, although Yeondaedo has only limited resolution. Yukji-do on the southern coast of Korea contains nearly 95% Jomon ancestry. Although our genetic analysis cannot itself distinguish between possible East Asian ancestries for Bronze Age Taejongni, given the Bronze Age date, it can be best modeled as Upper Sadian. A possible minor Jomon admixture is not statistically significant. We therefore observe a heterogeneous presence of Jomon ancestry in Neolithic Koreans, and its eventual disappearance over time as shown by a negligible Jomon contribution to present-day Koreans. The lack of a significant Jomon component in Taejongni indicates that early populations without detectable Jomon ancestry linked to present-day Koreans migrated to the Korean peninsula in association with rice farming and replaced Neolithic populations with some Jomon admixture. Although our genetic data currently do not have resolution to test this hypothesis, owing to limited sample size and coverage, we therefore associate the spread of farming to Korea with different waves of Amur and Yellow River gene flow, modeled by Hongshan for the Neolithic introduction of millet farming and by Upper Sadian for the Bronze Age addition of rice agriculture. Analyzing the genomes from Yayoi farmers, we found that, like Taejongni, they can be modeled as indigenous Jomon ancestry admixed with Bronze Age Upper Sadian ancestry. Our results support massive migration from Korea into Japan in the Bronze Age. The Nagabaka genomes from Miyako Island represent the first, to our knowledge, ancient genome-wide data from the Ryukyus. Contrary to previous findings that Holocene populations reached the southern Ryukyus from Taiwan, our results suggest that the prehistoric Nagabaka population originated in Jomon cultures to the north. The genetic turnover from Jomon to Yayoi-like ancestry before the early modern period mirrors the late arrival of agriculture and Ryukyu languages in this region. Triangulation of linguistic, archaeological, and genetic evidence shows that the origins of the Trans-Eurasian languages can be traced back to the beginning of millet cultivation in the early Amur gene pool in Neolithic Northeast Asia. The spread of these languages involved two major phases that mirror the dispersal of agriculture and genes. The first phase, represented by the primary splits in the Trans-Eurasian family, goes back to the early Middle Neolithic, when millet farmers associated with Amur-related genes spread from the West Liao River to contiguous regions. The second phase, represented by linguistic contacts between the five daughter branches, goes back to the late Neolithic, Bronze and Iron Ages, when millet farmers with substantial Amur ancestry gradually admixed with Yellow River, Western Eurasian, and Jomon populations and added rice, West Eurasian crops, and pastoralism to the agricultural package. This is the integration of linguistic, agricultural, and genetic expansions in Northeast Asia. Amur ancestry is marked in red, Yellow River ancestry in green, and Jomon ancestry in blue. The red arrows show the eastward migrations of millet farmers in Neolithic, bringing Koreanic and Tungusic languages to the indicated regions. The green arrows mark the integration of rice agriculture in the late Neolithic and the Bronze Age, bringing the Japonic language over Korea to Japan. Bringing together the spatiotemporal and subsistence patterns, we find clear links between the three disciplines. The onset of millet cultivation in the West Liao region around the 9th millennium BP can be associated with substantial Amur-related ancestry and overlaps in time and space with the ancestral Trans-Eurasian speech community. In line with recent associations between the Sino-Tibetan family, estimated in 8000 BP, and Neolithic farmers from the upper and middle Yellow River, our results associate the two centers of millet domestication in Northeast Asia with the origins of two major language families, Sino-Tibetan on the Yellow River and Trans-Eurasian on the West Liao River. The lack of evidence for Yellow River influence in the ancestral Trans-Eurasian language and genes is consistent with the multicentric origins of millet cultivation suggested in archaeobotany. The early stages of millet domestication in the 9th to 7th millennia BP are accompanied by population growth, leading to the formation of environmentally or socially separated subgroups in the West Liao region and broken connectivity between speakers of Altaic and Japano-Koreanic. Around the mid-6th millennium BP, some of these farmers started to migrate eastwards, around the Yellow Sea into Korea and northeast into the Primorai, bringing Koreanic and Tungusic languages to these regions and bringing from the West Liao region additional Amur ancestries to the Primorai and mixed Amur, Yellow River ancestries to Korea. Our newly analyzed Korean genomes are notable in that they testify to the presence of an admixture of Jomon-related ancestries outside Japan. The Late Bronze Age saw extensive cultural exchange across the Eurasian steppe, which resulted in the admixture of populations from the West Liao region and the Eastern steppe with Eastern Eurasian genetic lineages. Linguistically, this interaction is mirrored in the borrowing of agro-pastoral vocabulary by Proto-Mongolic and Proto-Turkic speakers, especially relating to wheat and barley cultivation, herding, dairying, and horse exploitation. Around 3300 BP, farmers from the Liaodong, Shandong area migrated to Korean Peninsula, adding rice, barley, and wheat to millet agriculture. This migration aligns with the genetic components modeled as Upper Scythian in our Bronze Age sample from Korea, and is reflected in early borrowings between Japonic and Koreanic languages. Archaeologically, it can be associated with agriculture in the larger Liaodong-Shandong area without being specifically restricted to Upper Scythian material culture. In the 3rd millennium BP, this agricultural package was transmitted to Kyushu, triggering a transition to full-scale farming, a genetic turnover from Jomon to Yayoi ancestry, and a linguistic shift to Japonic. By adding unique samples from Nagabaka in the southern Ryukyus, we trace the farming language dispersals to the edge of the Trans-Eurasian world, demonstrating that Jomon ancestry stretched as far south as Miyako Island. Our results contradict previous assumptions of a northward expansion by Austronesian populations from Taiwan. Together with the Jomon profile discovered at Yukjido in Korea, our results show that Jomon genomes and material culture did not always overlap. By advancing new evidence from Asian DNA, our research thus confirms recent findings that Japanese and Korean populations have West Liao River ancestry, whereas it contradicts previous claims that there is no genetic correlate of the Trans-Eurasian language family. Although some previous research regarded the Trans-Eurasian zone as beyond the area suitable for farming, our research confirms that the farming language dispersal hypothesis remains an important model for understanding Eurasian population dispersals. Triangulation of linguistics, archaeology, and genetics resolves that competition between the pastoralist and farming hypothesis and concludes that the early spread of Trans-Eurasian speakers was driven by agriculture.